This, my friends, is an outrage. Welcome to episode 1 of the Connected Integrated show. And boy, we have a really crazy story to share with you on our very first episode. You guessed it right, this is all about the UK Post Office IT scandal. Something which has become big in the news in January 2024 because of a docudrama that was shown on British television, on ITV, called Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, which is all about the human impact of this IT scandal, colossal blunder, a miscarriage of justice, an actual travesty that was perpetrated by the British government, and as not only as the government itself, but as the shareholder of the Post Office in the UK, and then of course the way in which this cascaded down into the IT services and contracting that went on to actually bring about this system.
And why did no one believe us for this amount of time? This is useless government IT. The same firm, Fujitsu, did the NHS IT system.
Blijf liever met beide benen op de grond. Praat met ICL. Makers van functionele computersystemen en praktijkgerichte software.
Fujitsu.
Ça fait 7000 ans qu'on exploite la même ressource naturelle, le feu. Pourquoi le feu? Parce que ça brûle.
Il fait 21 degrés chez moi.
Nos clients, ils ne peuvent pas brûler en enfer dans le confort.
Fujitsu, what do you know that we don't know?
Fujitsu.
So, just as a refresher, the Connected Integrated show is all about the intersection between IT, in other words, software, applications, information systems, and automation and process control, in other words, OT, or operational technologies. And in this case, this could be machinery, sensors, actuators on the factory floor, or in the case of a post office, it's the weigh scales for measuring how much does a parcel weigh or a letter weigh, and the point of sales terminals, the printers, the barcode scanners, effectively the equipment that allows the real world, the physical realm, to become part of the digital world and vice versa, right? So this is very much that interface point between the real world and the digital world. And then the third part are telecommunications, and this is really one of those crazy bits of historical, how can we say, historical fun and games, in the fact that this project, the program to develop a new IT system for the post office, was very much done and specified. The requirements were laid down in the days before the internet became our predominant way of doing telecommunications. The internet, of course, being a packet switched network. Back in the 1990s, when all of this was on the drawing board, we were very much in the old world of the public public telephone network, the old PSTN, the circuit switched world, the world where, again, most telephone lines were analog in nature, and technologies like ISDN, the Integrated Services Digital Network, were very, very new and were seen to be highly innovative because they provided a digital circuit instead of an analog circuit. But I digress.
Why does that computer look like it's your boss?
Why not change the way we work? With a BT ISDN line, there's no need to fax or byte documents. Information simply flows between computers in seconds. Call BT now and save £80 on connection.
TV.
PC.
TV.
PC.
TV.
PC.
TV.
The UK Post Office IT scandal is obviously something which is of major importance. It's probably the biggest, the largest example of a colossal failure. A failure of strategy, a failure of alignment, a failure of technology, architecture, and a failure above all of implementation and of project and program management.
Why was Horizon important for the Post Office's business?
In the 1980s, we'd gone through a monopoly and mergers inquiry, which had come up with the beautiful term at the end that post office counters should be managed for decline. It was something that we rejected, but we also knew that you couldn't go on with a paper-based system forever and ever, because that would lead to decline. And the discussion had always been, as you looked at the banks and you looked at other organizations, that with the kind of network we had, it needed to be automated. We couldn't see a long-term commercial solution without automation. It was particularly important to the Department of Social Security because they accounted for probably 25%, if not more, of the turnover for post office counters. This was all the pensions work that was done at post offices. We also knew even then two things. One, they felt we were very expensive, which I always rejected, but that's what they said. And secondly, that they wanted to move towards automated credit transfer, where you didn't have to use the network at all. And if they'd been left to their own devices, that's where they would have gone, and they would have gone quickly to it. So for all those reasons, automating what we did at post offices became vital to us, and it became the main strategy for the business as you went through the 90s and then into the 2000s.
The commercial aspect, which united Pockle and Pathway, was not an issue for the BA, that's the benefits agency, who actually had the means to pursue different options without infringing contract obligations. Can you tell us, what was the commercial aspect that you considered united Pockle and Pathway?
The contract that we eventually had with ICL opened the door, we thought, to look at new products. The initial ones after the Horizon project had been fully implemented was to look at government issues like Government Gateway, which now provides the link into most of the government services, many of which we were handling individually at post office counters. It was also a move into banking, because if we had the IT system, which could well have been provided beyond Horizon by ICL, then that would give us a greater opportunity to get into more sensible banking. And one of the things that had always concerned us was what was in those days called, probably still is, the unbanked. That meant if they, as we thought, would over time become the banked, we'd rather they retained a link with post office counters, which had some kind of bank, than go anywhere else. And I think it led in the end to a very close relationship after my time with the Bank of Ireland, who were providing services via the counter.
No, I wasn't responsible for it in the latter part of the programme. But I couldn't see how you could roll out a system at the pace that we were rolling it out and also train people that had such a wide-ranging capability. And I could appreciate that some of the postmasters and postmistresses would be horrified by the implementation of an IT system, especially that one day you're manual and the next day you're fully automated.
Let's consider now, in the time we have, and I will finish before lunch, sir, Horizon for Pockle's specific needs was a frantic afterthought, wasn't it?
No. No, the reason it may appear like that is because we didn't have a documented functional requirement.
And you mentioned that because you thought that it was apparent from both the DSS and POCL that they thought that they could just give you their functional requirements before it was supposed to go initially live in 1997. You say that in your statement.
Absolutely. It became apparent to me that they didn't understand the basic philosophy of a PFI, in that you write a specification, you then get a quote, and then you deliver to what you said you would deliver and the functional requirement. And that's the reason why, in the contract that we gave to BA and POCL, in the contract that was signed, it said that within 30 days of the contract being signed, they would sign off the functional requirement.
Right.
Because that's what we had.
Well, let's hold that, because what you've just said there is very, very important. But I want to address a more fundamental problem as to why I suggest it was a bit of a frantic afterthought.
Management. So when it comes to failure, it literally ticks all the boxes for the different places where you can fail in an ambitious organization, or even in the case of the post office, a societal transformation. And why is this important today in 2024? Well, it's important today in 2024 because we are looking at pretty deep societal transformation and a recognition that where we are coming from in the last 30 odd years and where we are likely going to is that we're taking technology for granted, and we're in a way assuming that digital transformation is going to somehow lead us to a better world and a better society for all of us who live in it. And what we're failing to recognize is that the technology and the implementation of technology really is subordinate to our society and our human and the interactions and the choices that we make as human beings to organize society in a way that works well for all of us. And if we go back to the very beginning, to the early 1990s, where there was some rather significant questions raised within the UK government, and in fact within the ruling political party of the time, which by the way is the same party which currently is in power in the United Kingdom. There were some serious existential questions about what kind of society do we want to have, and how do we want to make sure that the economy functions in society.
I'm closing down the something for nothing society. This summer I announced tougher rules affecting so-called New Age travellers. Most people were as sickened as I was by the sight of these sponges descending like locusts, demanding benefits with menaces. We are not in the business of subsidising scoundrels. And we've tightened up on bogus asylum seekers. It's right to help genuine victims of persecution, but not those whose persecution is fraudulent. And it's outrageous when people claim using a dozen different invented names. So we've clamped down on forged claims, and already nearly 20,000 have evaporated into thin air.
And with any kind of political agenda, right, there is always going to be an element of greed and an element of power play involved in these kinds of vision and decision making around the vision. So, to come back to all of this, right, the original intention was, in the early 90s, to change the way in which welfare benefits were paid to millions of people in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is one of the original welfare states in the world. This was a post-war program after the Second World War by the Attlee government that succeeded the Churchill government, and Clement Attlee and the Labour Party, which were in power at the time, really put together a very strong case to provide social services to help rebuild the country after the devastation of a world war. And if we look back at history and we look at what normally happens after a major conflict and when the time comes to rebuild society, it's quite normal that there is a period of time in which there is a transfer of wealth or a transfer of money in order to uplift the majority, in order to kind of rebuild that foundation, if you like, of a functional society. And the same is true in many Western European countries. Where I'm based in France, this is no different. But the specifics of the implementation, the political choices that are made, and then of course the different handovers or transition between political parties in power and their philosophy on how they want society to be is obviously going to determine what we have today. But unpacking all of that, we can see that there's definitely an issue which in the early 1990s the government, so the Conservative government that was in power, this was John Major's government that took over when Margaret Thatcher left Downing Street and left the prime ministership. So John Major's government at the time were very keen to again put in place stricter controls on how welfare benefits were being paid out. There was a perception, and again without going into the details or the specifics, is that it's possible that the reality was that there was a lot of fraud happening at the time, but it's conjecture, and it doesn't matter whether there really was fraud or there wasn't really fraud happening. The fact of the matter is that the political party in power at the time presented an argument to say we need to have a better way of paying out welfare benefits to the population, right? So that we know that the right amount is going to the right person at the right time. Now, on face value, nothing wrong with that. But if we unpack the entire system as it was in the early 1990s, the way it was set up was that it was highly distributed through the post office network. So the UK Post Office and what became known as Post Office Counters Limited, which was the business that was responsible for running the actual post offices, the branch offices, and again the actual point of sale where a member of the public would actually be able to obtain service, send a letter, buy stamps, and then also cash in their pension, obtain money. And if you look at this whole setup, right, a huge chunk of the actual system and the network was geared around paying out benefits, whether they were government pensions, whether they were childcare benefits, whether they were other types of payments that were related to a social security safety net. There's a colossal sum of money involved, and this money is obviously flows from the Treasury, and the Treasury, obviously, their money comes from typically taxes that are collected, various other sources of government revenue, and of course borrowing. And when a country ends up financing their public sector through debt, they typically are going to be borrowing money in order to, again, boost the amount that's available in the Treasury that they can deploy. So with all of this in mind, obviously, somewhere in the middle of all of this, there's an opportunity to profit. Because if you can get into a system where many transactions are happening, and if you can take a cut off that transaction, you've obviously got a captive stream of revenue, of income. And if we think about the way in which let's say the strategy was taking shape from this vision, this political vision, was that the strategy was very much around making sure that a new system, a new way of working could be put in place. So in other words, a transformation program could be put in place to change the way the UK Post Office counters were operating as a retail distribution network, in order for transactions to be traced more effectively, more accurately. And so somewhere in the middle of all of this, we have a public-private partnership. And this public-private partnership is a way for a government, the public sector, to move some of their investment off their balance sheet. So, something which became, and certainly became popular in the United Kingdom in the 1990s, was a private finance initiative. So private finance initiatives were all about engaging with private sector corporations who would then build and operate a public service on behalf of a ministry or an implementation agency. So coming back to the whole roots or origins of this Post Office IT scandal in the UK, the Department of Social Security, the Department of Posts and Communications, so in other words, the department, the ministry that's responsible for everything to do with the post office and postal services, and the ministry that is responsible for Social Security and ensuring that welfare and benefits are again administered properly, decided, and again this was very much a government decision, to go for a private finance initiative. And where this gets really interesting is, of course, this is being done in the national interest. So it makes sense to leverage a national private sector party that would be able to build and operate the system. Now, in the news today, and of course what I even have on my screen behind me there, right, is the name of a company, Fujitsu. And Fujitsu is a Japanese company. And it's very easy to deflect attention today by saying, oh, look, it's a Japanese company that is, was responsible for the technology and for the integration and the development and the operations, and let us hold a foreign company to account for this. It's very easy to blame someone outside of your own country. And we tend to make a big deal about these kinds of patterns of ownership. But the original contract and the original program, which was called Pathway, So Pathway was all about benefits and benefits payment processing or benefits distribution. And the Horizon IT system, which again was the point of sales system and the transaction network for the post office counters, that was again part of what Pathway was all about. This was all done with ICL, and ICL by 1992 had ended up being 80% owned by Fujitsu, and the reason for that is quite simple. ICL was originally created in the 1960s in the UK to be a national technology champion for computers.
ICL is one of Europe's biggest and most successful manufacturers of computers, but it hasn't always been like this. It was a very different company back in the early 80s, quite the reverse of its success now. It suffered from high staff turnover, poor productivity, and quality control problems.
Well, I think we've basically tried to change the company from a technology-led company into a people-led company. We realised that whatever else we did, we would not be successful unless we made our people just world-class. So we got them involved, all 25,000 of them. We listened to them, understood their aspirations. We provided the vision and direction, the way we wanted the company to go, and then got all of our people involved in achieving that direction. And I think that, out of anything, has made ICL itself a successful worldwide company. So people first and people
like IBM. And it's interesting to see what other kinds of companies were out there, because there are parallels in other countries around the world. If we look at France, we have Bull, and if we look at Italy, there was Olivetti. In Germany, there was Nixdorf, which ended up becoming part of the Siemens empire. And of course, in Japan, there was Fujitsu. And a lot of these companies were all set up originally to build tabulating machines. Machines for doing accounting data processing and statistical data processing. So very much the kinds of machines that were required to take tabular data, so data that's in the format of a table, and load it in and perform computations, typically to add, subtract, multiply, so arithmetic, and then perform some other types of calculations in order to produce a tabulated output. And this was very much the way in which information processing was done in the middle part of the 20th century. So ICL ended up having their own, their own journey in the UK. Very often they didn't have a great reputation because of poor customer service, poor quality. So the technology wasn't seen to be very reliable. So there were a number of reputational issues that ICL had. And ICL ended up having to be bailed out by the UK government a number of times. But as ICL started to build more and more sophisticated computers, they ended up collaborating more with foreign companies, including a division of Fujitsu called LSI for large-scale integrated circuits. And again, this is all about providing some more complex chips, integrated circuit chips, that were used as part of computing products. And so it became fairly natural, given this relationship that had been built over time, for Fujitsu to come in. And it was great for the UK government to say, oh, you know what? Let's rather have the Japanese take over, funding the further development of ICL, and we'll wipe our hands of it. You know, the 1980s in the UK was very much part of a of a privatization agenda. You know, a lot of the crown jewels were sold off, and perhaps that's kind of the heart of where, you know, things ended up in the 1990s, where there was a much larger wave of privatization that occurred. And this was a worldwide thing. You know, I think back to where I was at the beginning of my career in the 1990s, and there certainly was a lot of either full-on privatization or partial privatization going on in a number of different sectors. So as an average, you know, as a typical, you know, let's say resident, a taxpayer, a citizen of a country, you know, one tends to have a mental picture of what it means to, you know, what a public service is all about. And I think what we've perhaps lost sight with is we've lost sight public services have effectively become privatized. So, coming back to the UK Post Office. So the UK Post Office obviously were, together with them, their single shareholder, the UK government, put together a strategy. And this strategy in the mid-1990s was all about ensuring that the post offices themselves, the post office counters, would be able to survive a fundamental shift in the way in which services, you know, transactions were, retail transactions were provided. And some of the statistics that were being used to inform the strategy making were pointing towards a decline in the number of post offices over time, and the fact that some of the smaller post offices were uneconomical to operate. And so again, the strategy was built around how to change this. And so coming back to the scandal and the people who were impacted by the scandal, who were known as sub-postmasters. Sub-postmasters, in effect, were simply like a franchisee. They owned an independent business and acted as an agent of the UK Post Office. So they operated a post office inside typically their primary small business, like a corner store, off license, a village shop, a tea room. And, you know, for the most part, a lot of sub-postmasters opted into this as a way of supplementing their income and having some kind of stability, because this was pretty much guaranteed. You know, if you signed up as a sub-postmaster into the post office, you had a long-term contract and you were guaranteed a wage. And there were obviously certain captive services that were provided, in particular benefits payouts, pension payouts, where again customers, you know, the general public had to come into the post office to obviously receive these benefits. So there was a guarantee of a certain amount of work and therefore a certain amount of money that would flow through the system, and a certain amount of money that could be used to again provide an income for a sub-postmaster. So if we look at some of the rationale behind this, it's quite easy to see that there was a desire to shift from a monolithic post office that was 100% publicly operated, and to then again take the more marginal, less directly profitable, if it was to stay part of the monolith, right, these parts, and to rather contract it out. So it's a way of transferring risk. And by the same token, this is no different to any large corporation that does a strategic review and identifies what core business they're focused on and what is non-core, and how they would best divest or, you know, outsource these non-core activities. And of course, over the last 30 years, we've had successive waves of IT outsourcing. And this comes back to this whole point about, you know, where the underlying issues ended up manifesting themselves in a fundamentally broken system architecture and a system implementation, because we start to get out of alignment when we outsource. Without a very strong alignment in the relationship between the service provider, so the contracted party, and the end user customer, we will struggle to actually ensure that the strategies line up well. Because when we want to move, for example, a particular investment off balance sheet and say, hey, you know, Mr. IT service company, go ahead and do this thing for me, right? A lot of the decision making will be determined by the actual strategy of that company. And this is where it's telling with the whole Fujitsu and ICL saga as the IT company responsible for the technology implementation, is that their strategy and their needs, their wants, their desires, their existential, let's say, desire to, their own proper existential desire was certainly becoming divergent from the UK government and certainly from the post office. And of course the other government departments like Social Security and Benefits Agency. So as ICL was becoming more Fujitsu than the old ICL, which again started in 1992 when Fujitsu took an 80% ownership stake, and by the time 1998 rolled around, ICL was a 100% owned subsidiary of Fujitsu. So this means that their strategy was very much in the process of diverging from the UK government and UK public sector. And it also comes back to this whole thing of putting together a private finance initiative. It's very easy for the end user or for the beneficiary of the PFI, so in other words the UK government and the ministry and obviously the public sector companies that are owned by the government, to say, yeah, great, you know what, we'll get this PFI hammered out, we don't have to invest any of our money, so we can save on treasury, we can avoid having to increase the deficit, and we can take the public money that we're responsible for managing and put that to a different use. Fine, fair enough. But the issue is that the PFI, the actual investment, needs to be made by the private sector entity that's being contracted in this case ICL Pathway, which became, you know, Fujitsu Services, and again 100% part of the Fujitsu group. So you've got Fujitsu ICL on one hand that are putting an enormous amount of money in to developing a system, right? And sure, okay, you need to do that. But you're doing that at the expectation that you're going to secure a long-term income stream, a long-term cash flow. So you've got a business case that you're making, and this business case is obviously your own business case, and that business case is probably divergent from the business case that the end user, the actual beneficiary organization, is putting together. So the business plan or the financial forecast, the business case that the UK government and the post office would have been putting together certainly would have been built around how much they were going to be paying Fujitsu ICL once the system was implemented, and over a long period of time. And so they baked that into their forecast, and obviously they then geared all of their numbers around how they expected post office counters to operate, and what kinds of products and services they would be selling, and how many customers they would be having, etc., etc. You know, and it's by the way, it's these particular parts of, again, let's say a business transformation that are actually so much more important, because when they are defined, they're going to then drive a lot of the decision making that hits the technology roadmap and the technology architecture and implementation. And if those are incorrect, if there are incorrect assumptions made, if it turns out that there's insufficient transparency or willingness to, again, question some of these assumptions, because a lot of these are based on assumptions. And no matter how well we can actually define risks and put in place risk management practice and the ability to identify and to have contingencies, things are still based on assumption. And we know that in a market, the market can shift, and this is where things definitely go wrong. So I guess my point of all of this is that, yeah, we ended up with a pretty big mess in the UK, and this big mess in the UK is now coming to light, and it should be a massive wake-up call to all of us around the world as we are seeing similar existential questions regarding vision, strategy being raised within the political class, within governments around the world, as to how they would like to reshape or transform government functions, public sector services, but more importantly, how society is going to actually work. And for me, and in my view, the biggest failure and the real shame with this UK Post Office IT scandal is that the vision and the intention of building a society in a certain way and what was required to transform society was something that was not done with inclusivity in mind, and certainly was not looking at some basic principles, characteristics like dignity, like equity, justice, all right, and then also the ability to ensure that everyone has the ability to, again, live a dignified life. And for me, this is like the biggest travesty with all of this. Anyway, on the technology piece, what makes this thing really crazy was that this whole system called Horizon was originally meant to include a number of features, a number of technology features which were geared around securing benefits payments. This whole thing of having a benefits payment card. In the 1990s, this was a credit card with a magnetic stripe, and on the magnetic stripe was again the actual beneficiary's personal details encoded on that mag stripe. And of course that token, if you like, would be used to compare against the personal details in a database. So this was a way of, again, having a second factor to authenticate the beneficiary against the system to say, yes, this is indeed the correct person. And you know, if you look at any kind of implementation for rolling out identity tokens, whether they be identity cards, travel documents like passports, various other tokens which are used to assert identity. If we look at the United States, which does not actually have a identity document as such for citizens of the USA, this tends to end up being a state-issued driver's license. So obviously, if you don't have a driver's license, well, you can't get a state-issued ID document. And it gets really quite interesting when we explore the arguments for and against these identity tokens. And really the question of identity is fundamental to finding or determining, right, the correct parameters for society. Before our modern world, identity was very much something that happened within the local community or tribe. So the extended family or families of families that would live pretty much in proximity to each other. So in more traditional societies, more ancient ways of, again, asserting identity is that you knew who you were, or people knew who you were, because you were the child of people who were known, who were the children of people who were also known. And so it was a lot easier to, again, to build this trust, because someone could actually vouch for your identity. Yes, we know for sure that person is the son or the daughter of these people. And in a way, this very traditional principle of identity was something that was inherently or implicitly, in fact it wasn't inherent, it was implicit inside the UK Post Office counters network, because of the community relationship between the sub-postmaster as a trusted member of the community and the residents of that community. And this whole notion of identity and of, again, being able to create a token which, again, can demonstrate or provide some additional proof of identity, that was not thought through at all. In fact, the entire strategy of the Post Office Horizon system was very much focused around the commercial transactions, the retail transactions. Because at the end of the day, it was all about the money. It was all about the top level of the post office, right? The Post Office Board and the UK government as a shareholder wanting to make sure that the financial flows were sound. Because after all, they were going to close down or change post offices from that were uneconomically or not economically viable into these franchise, independently owned and operated agencies. And in order to do that, there had to be a degree of control on the accounting of the financial transactions. And so that was the focus. And of course, the identity piece was a complete afterthought, if it was even thought of at all. I mean, it must have been thought of to some degree because of this original magnetic stripe card, this benefits card, right? But the idea of how you would issue these cards, who would do that, and who would effectively provide the notary service. So again, this is the whole thing of like, who performs the role of a notary public, who again has that statutory role to play, where again a notary is a person who is, again, so strong in their fiduciary responsibility that they can build trust more easily, and that there are countermeasures in place to deal with abuse of trust. Now, it's quite rare to find a corrupt notary, because the penalties for abusing that position of trust are very severe. Anyway, this is turning out to be a very long-winded, long discussion about identity, about financial transactions, about crap IT and crap IT systems, and also terribly poor architecture and terribly poor technical governance, and a total misalignment between technical governance and political governance. And of course, all of the business implications when you've got bad political governance and bad technical governance. So as we conclude this very first episode of the Connected Integrated Show, allow me to share a few parting thoughts. If we look at the UK Post Office IT scandal, it's abundantly clear that this was a total failure, a failure from the very top down to the very bottom, from politics all the way through to the technology implementation details. And there's some lessons that are coming out of this public inquiry which I think are very instructive, and I think it's important for all of us, particularly who work in the IT, in the automation, process control, and in the telecommunications space, to really absorb what's coming out of this public inquiry and to reflect very carefully on the road ahead, on where we are going as human society, and how the different nation states in the world and how the nation states cooperate amongst themselves between, international treaties and international institutions. It's vital that we look at the human element and the fact that we're all human beings on this planet, and our individual and collective well-being, security, safety, and just general ability to get on with our lives without being persecuted, without being marginalized, without, again, having basic fundamental needs become a terrible life or death struggle for survival. These are the things that I'm sure we can all agree on as people. And if we look at today's world and the fact that a number of countries, I believe it's about 60 of them, are having elections this year. The United States is a clear example of a very turbulent environment where there is polarization between people who believe that the country and those who govern it need to be of a certain persuasion and a certain mindset. And in the midst of polarization, we really have to zoom out and find this common ground. Because if we don't find common ground and we don't look at what are the basic things that allow us, that make us human, that allow us to, again, live our best lives, then we're heading for trouble. And no technology is going to solve this. No artificial intelligence, no blockchain, no cryptocurrency. All of these things are nice on their own and they show that we as engineers can be very creative, very inventive, and that again technology can bring innovation to how we do things, but this needs to be tempered with what kind of world do we want to build. So I wish to thank you for having stuck through the entire episode, and don't forget to hit like, hit subscribe, follow the show on YouTube, follow the show on LinkedIn, and follow the show on Substack. Links are down below. And see you for episode 2.